Welcome to True Crime Threads, where buried secrets unravel one thread at a time. Today, we uncover the shocking truth behind a forbidden relationship that ended in a chilling double murder inside a secluded monastery. Nestled deep in the misty hills of northern Italy, the St. Ambrose Monastery stood in quiet isolation, surrounded by ancient pine forests and time-worn stone paths. It was a place where vows of silence were honored, where prayers echoed through candlelit halls, and where every man had supposedly renounced the world. From the outside, it seemed untouched by sin, a sanctuary for the devout, but behind the stone walls and beneath the solemn rituals, something dangerous was taking root. Among the monks living there was Brother Matteo, a 32-year-old known for his intellect, warm smile, and quiet charm, newer to the monastery than most. He had arrived just 2 years ago after leaving his secular life behind. Despite the rigid environment, Matteo had quickly gained favor among the elders and was deeply admired by the younger novices. He was diligent in his duties, eloquent in prayer, and carried himself with a calmness that made him well liked. Yet it was his bond with another monk that would soon draw unspoken attention. Brother Luca was older, nearing 50, a man of few words and sharp eyes. He had spent over 2 decades within St. Ambrose's walls and was known for his discipline. Yet, with Matteo, he was different. Observant monks noticed they often Saturday together during meals, worked side by side in the gardens, and walked quietly for hours after evening prayers. Though physical affection was never seen, there was an unmistakable intimacy in the way they interacted. At first, it seemed harmless, just a close spiritual connection, but soon, murmurs began to circulate. Some claimed they saw the 2 men entering the old wine cellar late at night, long after curfew. Others mentioned how Luca had become unusually protective, even possessive. Matteo, who had always been cheerful, started appearing anxious, glancing over his shoulder as if he feared being watched. But in a place where silence was sacred and confrontation was rare, no one asked questions out loud. Instead, they prayed and looked away. Then came a soul shift. Brother Matteo began requesting time alone, citing spiritual exhaustion. He withdrew from group reflections and appeared restless during Mass. Luca, too, had grown tense and distant, rarely speaking except to Matteo. One novice noticed a cut on Luca's knuckles. Another claimed to hear shouting from behind the garden, while something that had never happened before in the monastery's history. Still, nothing was reported. To speak of such matters would be unthinkable. The abbot, Father Girolamo, maintained the monastery's rigid routine. He made no mention of the rumors, but his sudden disapproval of Matteo's behavior became clear. Matteo was reassigned from the library to labor duties. His privileges were reduced. His letters to family previously encouraged or quietly intercepted. Luca, meanwhile, was summoned privately for long talks with the abbot. No one knew what was said, but afterward, his mood darkened even further. What had begun as a secret grew heavier with each passing week. Fear replaced affection, trust turned to paranoia. Yet the monastery, cold and cloistered, continued its rhythm prayers, silent meals. No one knew that it was all spiraling towards something irreversible. And, on the first Sunday of November, the silence would be broken not by bells or hymns, but by the discovery of 2 lifeless bodies inside the prayer tower. On a cold November morning, the calm routine of St. Ambrose Monastery was abruptly shattered. Frost clung to the trees, and mist drifted through the courtyards as the monks began their day with morning prayers. But before the final psalm could be sung, a scream pierced the silence, a sound rarely, if ever, heard within those ancient stone walls. It was Brother Tomas, the monastery's groundskeeper, who had gone to the old prayer tower to fetch tools stored inside. The door was slightly ajar, which was unusual, and a bitter, metallic scent hung in the air. When he stepped inside, what he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Lying face up on the cold stone floor was Brother Matteo, his neck slashed open, dried blood pooled beneath his head. Hanging above him, suspended from the rafters by a length of rope, was Brother Luca, motionless, his body swaying slightly in the drafty room. The horror of the scene quickly spread through the monastery. Some monks collapsed in shock. Others stood frowning, unable to comprehend what they had just heard. The abbot immediately contacted local authorities, who arrived within the hour. Police sealed off the area, escorted the monks into the chapel for questioning, and began collecting evidence. A note was discovered, wedged inside a psalm book left at the foot of the altar. It read simply, "Forgive me, for I loved him more than I loved God." The handwriting, though shaky, was identified as Lucas. At first glance, the story seemed to make grim sense. The evidence suggested that Brother Luca had killed Matteo and then taken his own life. The rope was tied with precision. The knife, found just a few feet away, had Luca's fingerprints. The time of death for both aligned with the early hours of the morning. It seemed to be a case of passion, guilt, and despair within the sacred confines of the monastery. But for Detective Elisa Romano, who had been called in to lead the investigation, due to the case's sensitivity, something didn't feel right. The timeline was tight, almost too perfect. The note felt theatrical, as if meant to simplify a much more complicated story. And as she walked the grounds, observing the daily routines of the monks, Elisa noticed a deep tension lingering in the air. There was more fear than grief, more avoidance than sorrow. It wasn't just the death that unsettled them, it was what those deaths might reveal. Elisa began with basic interviews. Many of the monks claimed to know nothing, speaking only when pressed. A few described Luca's recent mood swings. One monk admitted Matteo had seemed anxious, maybe even scared, in his final days. Another said he'd seen both men entering the old tower the night before, which was strictly off limits without permission, but no one could say why they had gone there, or what had really happened once the door closed behind them. The case, on paper, pointed to a murder-suicide driven by forbidden love. The church quietly urged a quick resolution, fearing scandal, but Elisa was not convinced. As she reviewed the scene again, she noticed small details. Others had missed a faint bruise on Matteo's wrist, scratch marks near the doorframe, and a missing surveillance tape from the hallway leading to the tower. She knew then that this case was far from over. Detective Elisa began her investigation with a sense of quiet determination. While the monastery offered a thought of peace, she sensed resistance beneath every interaction. The monks answered politely but carefully, as if weighing each word. They claimed to know little, and their stories blurred together, but inconsistencies began to surface. One monk insisted that Brother Luca had been withdrawn and depressed for weeks, barely speaking to anyone. Another claimed he had seen Luca smiling and lively just 2 days before the incident. A novice recalled that Matteo had been writing something in a notebook and then hiding it under his mattress. Elisa requested permission to inspect Matteo's small chamber, and the abbot reluctantly agreed. Inside, the room was sparsely unbed. One desk, a wooden cross on the wall, tucked under the thin mattress. Elisa found a collection of handwritten pages folded into an envelope. The contents were startling. They were deeply personal letters written by Matteo, never sent. Some described his feelings for Luca's guilt, his confusion, and his growing desire to leave the monastery. Others hinted at fear, referencing threats and pressure from someone he never named. One letter stated, "They said if I speak, they will silence me for good." The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged in places. These weren't the writings of a man preparing to die, but of someone desperately seeking a way out. Alongside the letters was a second, unopened envelope addressed to a journalist based in Milan. It had never been mailed, but it confirmed that Matteo was preparing to expose the truth. He was planning to reveal the affair, the silence of the church, and the hidden corruption he believed was poisoning the monastery. This changed everything. If Matteo had intended to go public, anyone invested in protecting the monastery's image had a motive to stop him. As Elisa continued her inquiry, she began to focus on Brother Stefano, a senior monk with considerable influence. Stefano had been at St. Ambrose for over 15 years. His name had surfaced more than once during interviews, usually as someone who kept a close eye on the younger monks. When questioned, Stefano remained composed but evasive. He denied knowing about any relationship between Matteo and Luca and claimed he was asleep in his chamber during the time of the murders. However, when investigators reviewed security logs for the night of the deaths, they found an anomaly. Brother Stefano had accessed the old prayer tower approximately 2 hours before the bodies were discovered. He claimed it was for private prayer, but Elisa found his explanation lacking. Forensics had already recovered fingerprints from the rope and knife but bore traces of Luca and Matteo. As expected, but partial prints belonging to Stefano were also present on the door handle and the railing inside the tower. It wasn't enough to arrest him, but he cast doubt on his story. Later, a search of Stefano's room revealed a torn page from Matteo's letters, hidden behind a loose stone near his bed. It was a clear sign that he had known more than he admitted. Confronted with this, Stefano didn't confess, but his silence spoke volumes. Elisa now knew this wasn't simply a tragic affair gone wrong. It was a web of secrets, and the deeper she went, the darker it became. Digging deeper into the investigation, Elisa turned her full attention to Brother Stefano. His fingerprints in the tower and the hidden letter fragment were strong indicators of involvement, but she needed more. Surveillance footage from the hallway leading to the tower was missing, the hard drive conveniently wiped. The monastery claimed it had been a technical failure, but the timing was too precise to ignore. Elisa requested backups and consulted with forensic IT experts. After hours of recovery work, fragments of the video were restored. They showed Stefano entering the hallway at 2:11 a.m., carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth, likely the rope and knife later used in the deaths. His movements were quick, purposeful, and he glanced over his shoulder more than once. Stefano was brought in again for questioning. Faced with the footage and the fingerprints, his composure cracked, but instead of admitting to the murders, he shifted the narrative. He confessed to discovering the relationship between Matteo and Luca weeks before their deaths. According to him, he saw it as a moral failure and a threat to the monastery's spiritual purity. Rather than report them directly, he confronted Matteo and demanded that the affair end. When Matteo refused and spoke of leaving the monastery, Stefano panicked. He feared scandal, feared exposure, and feared how the church would handle such a revelation. So he began following Matteo, reading his notes, and even intercepting his outgoing letters. That was how he found the draft addressed to the journalist. Stefano claimed he only intended to stop the letter from being sent. He said he tried to reason with Matteo to convince him to stay silent, but when Matteo refused, Stefano went to Father Girolamo. According to his version, the abbot instructed him to do what must be done to preserve the sanctity of the monastery. Elisa asked whether that was an order to kill. Stefano hesitated but said only that the abbot wanted it handled quietly. Still, it was clear he interpreted that silence as permission. As pressure mounted, more information emerged. Forensic analysis revealed that the knife used to kill Matteo had been cleaned before being placed near the body, suggesting staging. Furthermore, bruises on Matteo's arms indicated he had been restrained before his throat was cut. The scene had been arranged to appear like a crime of passion followed by suicide, but the evidence pointed to premeditation and manipulation. Elisa concluded that Matteo never had a chance to go public. He had been silenced before he could act. Luca, devastated by the murder and realizing what had happened, took his own life hours later. The relationship had not led to violence between the two lovers, it had led to their destruction at the hands of someone desperate to protect the illusion of purity. Now the case turned to Father Girolamo. The abbot had kept his distance from the investigation, offering brief statements and citing his devotion to prayer. But his influence over Stefano was undeniable. If he had given even a subtle suggestion to protect the monastery's name, he was no longer just a bystander. Elisa prepared for one final confrontation only that might reveal who truly orchestrated the double tragedy. Detective Elisa Romano knew the final answers lay with Father Girolamo. The abbot had maintained an image of detachment throughout the investigation. Always calm, always guarded, he spoke in scripture and deflected questions with vague reassurances. But Elisa had uncovered too many threads pointing back to him. The missing surveillance footage, Stefano's confession about being instructed to act, and the general atmosphere of fear surrounding the monastery, all of it led to the man at the top. She arranged a formal interview with Father Girolamo in his private study, a high-ceilinged room filled with books, old paintings, and the heavy scent of incense. His Saturday behind a polished oak desk, his fingers interlocked, eyes steady but wary. Eliza presented the evidence calmly, the timeline, the fingerprints, the staged crime scene, and Stefano's testimony. At first, the abbot denied everything. He claimed he had only advised Stefano to be cautious and prayerful, that he had never ordered or suggested any harm. He dismissed Stefano's words as the ramblings of a man overcome by guilt. But when Eliza showed him the recovered draft of Matteo's letter to the journalist and described its contents, a crack appeared in his composure. He looked down, his hands trembled slightly, and he remained silent longer than usual before responding. Finally, he admitted that he had known about the relationship for months. He had received an anonymous note slipped under his door describing Matteo and Luca's behavior. Instead of confronting them directly, he confided in Stefano. The abbot feared the consequences of the scandal more than the moral failing itself. A story like that could ruin not only the monastery, but damage the church's image. He spoke of duty, of protecting sacred ground, and of preserving the faith of thousands who saw the monastery as a symbol of holiness. When asked whether he gave Stefano permission to act violently, Girolamo insisted he never spoke those words. He said only that he wanted the threat contained. But Eliza had seen this pattern before leaders who spoke in careful riddles, knowing full well how their subordinates would interpret them. He had not wielded the knife himself, but he had laid the foundation for the crime to unfold. His silence, his fear, and his quiet pressure on Stefano created the environment that led to Matteo's death. With enough evidence to establish complicity, Father Girolamo was placed under investigation by both law enforcement and the Vatican. He was removed from his position, his reputation permanently stained. Stefano was formally charged with premeditated murder and obstruction of justice. The monastery was closed indefinitely, its silence now broken by the roar of scandal and sorrow. As for Brother Matteo and Brother Luca, their story was finally told, not as sinners, not as shameful figures, but as two men caught in the grip of a system that demanded secrecy over truth. They had loved each other in a place that denied them that right, and they had died because their love was seen as a threat to power. The tragedy exposed the darkness behind the monastery's sacred walls and served as a reminder that no plot, no matter how holy, can hide its sins forever.